that we recognize that words have agreed upon definitions. And I am really hot. There we go. All right. So though we recognize that words have agreed upon definitions, we also recognize through our experience that the meaning of a particular word or phrase can differ depending on who's saying it and who's hearing it. Let me give you a few examples. If, for example, there's going to be a press conference in the Rose Garden of the White House tomorrow, and the president stands to the podium and says, yay, goody, goody, revenue for the U.S. government is going to increase. Well, you know what that means. That means your taxes are going to go up. Let's suppose, for example, though, something happens this afternoon and you've got to go to the hospital, and you go in through the ER, but then you're going to be admitted. And once you're admitted and you're in a room, the staff, the nurses, the doctor, they're going to tell you something like this. We're going to come get you in about an hour, and we're going to give you a test, take you for a test. All right, so when they say that to you, what that actually means is that sometime around Thursday afternoon, somebody is actually going to come and take you down for that test. Or if you go to the doctor and he's doing a little procedure, if the doctor says to you, this may hurt a little bit, what that actually means is it's going to feel like an amputation without the benefit of anesthesia, right? Now, those of you who are married understand how this principle works as well, that when one spouse, one partner says to the other one thing, how that's heard or what that means to the other is very different. For example, in our life, Caroline she'll say something to me, and me listening to her means that I actually hear the words that she says. That's what listening means to me, that I hear what she says. For her, though, listening means that I'm actually not still watching the TV, and I'm actually looking at her and responding to what she says. Crazy. But there's other ways in which you see this work in married life. For example, shortly after we got married, Caroline had asked me one day, she said, how many kids do you think you'd like to have? I said, probably 2. I said, how about you? She said, I don't know, 2 or 3. Well, I didn't realize somehow in the process we would be adding those numbers. So there's Nathan and Andrew and Philip and Catherine and the one that's due December 24th. Surprise. Caroline is glad for that finally to be out, so you quit thinking she's fat. Anyway, but what the point was that oftentimes what we say has a different meaning to those that are hearing it. Let me give you one more example. And I'll give this to you in the form of a question. What does the word forgive mean to you? Now, what forgiveness means to you and to this crowd collectively, there's going to be some variation. Some of you may say, well, to forgive someone that has wronged me or offended me means that we just go along in spite of it, and we go along to get along and just kind of pretend it didn't happen. Or some of you say, well, no, forgiveness means that I just try to put it out of my mind and act as though it never actually occurred. Forgiveness can, a crowd this size, have all sorts of different personal, practical meanings to you. But as followers of Christ, we've got this expectation given by the Lord in Colossians chapter 3. And this is what God says to us. Bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. Here's the expectation that you and I forgive as God has forgiven us. That what we are to model towards each other, whether it's in the home or it's in the community, in interpersonal relationships, God expects us as His followers that we forgive as He has forgiven us, to forgive God's way. All right, so if that's the expectation, it leads us back to the question we started back in a moment ago, which is, what does that mean? What does that mean to actually forgive God's way? I think we find the answer to that question as we bring all this together today, culminating the conclusion of a series of messages through Joseph's life. We're going to pick up this morning in Genesis chapter 45. Genesis 45, if you would look with me there in your Bibles. Genesis chapter 45. We're going to deal actually, as the message unfolds, all the way down through verse 15, but we're going to start with just the first few verses. Genesis 45, starting with verse 1. There we're told that Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Make every one go out from me." So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Does my father still live?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near to me." So they came near, and he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt." All right, so let me set the stage for you as to, again, what we're talking about. What exactly, if God has told us that we are to forgive each other as He has forgiven us, what does that mean? What exactly does that look like? Well, Joseph becomes really a case study in what this looks like, because if anybody has been wrong, Joseph certainly was. His brothers had betrayed him. They'd sold him into slavery. I mean, they originally planned to kill him. It doesn't get much worse than that. They had horribly wronged him. But what we're seeing here at work is Joseph forgiving God's way. Again, what does that mean? Well, what it means, first of all, is that you see the deed for what it is. You see the deed for what it is. All right, so that we're on the same page in terms of the storyline, Joseph has been essentially conducting an investigation to see if his brothers are the same as they were 20-some years ago when they really wronged him. Joseph is operating as the prime minister of Egypt, and he's gone through this series of episodes where he's kind of testing them to see, are they in fact actually different? When last we left him, all of the brothers have come to Egypt. They don't know who he is. They don't recognize him. He's not speaking their language. He's speaking in Egyptian and then through a translator to them, and so they haven't caught on as to who they're talking to. They've just experienced this feast that Joseph has had them for, and he's getting ready to send them back home, back to their father's home. But they're going to go back with these sacks of grain. And Joseph tells his steward, in the youngest, in Benjamin's sack of grain, "I want you to put my silver cup in there. And once the brothers get out of town, I want you to chase after them, demand to see what's in their bags, and then we'll go from there." And that's exactly what happens. The steward goes out, and he looks in the sacks of grain of all the brothers, and sure enough, in Benjamin's sack of grain, there is that silver cup. Well, at this point, all the brothers come back to Joseph, and they recognize we're in a heap of trouble, because it looks absolutely like they have stolen the personal silver cup of the prime minister of Egypt. That's bad. That's really bad. And so, as they go before Joseph, Judah speaks up, and he says, "You know what? I'm going to take the fall for this. I want you to keep me, Joseph, I want you to keep me in prison here. You do whatever you've got to do to me. Keep me in jail for the rest of my life. Let me rot in this prison. But please, by all means, let my brother Benjamin and the rest of my brothers go back home to my father." If he were to lose Benjamin now, after having lost Joseph those years before, it would just kill him. I mean, the grief that he would go through, I cannot bear the thought of that. Please, let him go. I'll take his place. Well, at this point, Joseph knows these guys are completely different than they were 20-some years before. That God has worked through circumstances, and He's very much and deeply affected them. They are changed men. And so we pick up there in verse 1 of chapter 45. We're told at this point that Joseph could not restrain himself before those who stood before him. And so it has been bubbling up inside for him for months. He has so desperately been wanting to let his brothers know his real identity. And now finally we're getting ready for the reveal. And so he tells all the servants and the hirelings, you get out of here, and it's just Joseph in this room alone with his brothers. Verse 2 says that he wept aloud. He is overcome with emotion. He has been waiting for this moment literally for decades. Beyond that, he is so moved by the difference that God has wrought in his brothers' lives, and he's so anxious for the next stage of life to be able to share with them. And then in verse 3, he says, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? Now, hearing this, we're told that his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed or literally terrified in his presence. You know, the fact that they can't say anything, that kind of stands to reason. If all of a sudden you're standing before somebody who literally holds the power of life and death over you, you really don't want to be the person that once talked about killing them. You really don't want to be the person that once sold them into slavery. They're just stammering there. They have nothing to say. But notice again how Joseph deals with them. He says, I am Joseph, your brother. So he communicates his identity. But notice what else he does. I am Joseph. Does my father still live? They're dismayed by this. Verse 4, they don't know what to say. And so Joseph asks them, come near to me. Guys, I want you to get a good look. Look into my eyes. See if all of this rings a bell. And then he says at the end of verse 4, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. He communicates his identity, but notice also what he does. He communicates their deed for what it was. Hey guys, I'm Joseph. I'm the brother you sold into slavery. Now, what's going on in that? He is calling their deed for exactly what it was. Now, for some, the thought of forgiveness is a difficult prospect. For some, the thought of forgiving an individual who has wronged you seems to be overwhelmingly painful and virtually impossible because there's this thought in your mind that if I forgive them, then that somehow means that I excuse what was done, or that I say, well, it's as if nothing really happened. Oh, it wasn't that big of a deal. But in your heart, you know it was a really big deal. It really hurt. It was really offensive. It really bothered you. It kept you up at night. It affected the direction of your life. And so you find it difficult to extend forgiveness because you think, well, me extending forgiveness means that I just say it wasn't that big of a deal. Oh, it was nothing. Well, what we see here, I believe, again, is a case study in a man forgiving God's way. And as he forgives God's way, he calls the deed for exactly what it was. He does not excuse it. He doesn't rationalize it. He has seen that these men are different, and as he's getting ready to extend forgiveness, he calls their wrong for exactly what it was. One of the most familiar and often quoted verses in all the Bible is 1 John 1:9. Many of you can recite it even after me. You remember what John says? If we confess our sins, He, that's God, is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Great verse, tremendous promise. But what's interesting is that the word that John uses that's translated as confess literally means not simply to agree with, but to say the same thing as. When you and I come to God and we've sinned against Him, what God is looking for from us is that we call our act, our word, our motivation, our thought, whatever it is, that we call it exactly what God calls it. That we don't play games with it, that we don't rationalize it, but God calls this sin. I'm going to call it exactly the same thing. In truth, we see this exact same type of principle going on with Joseph and his brothers. He is calling their behavior for exactly what it was. Understand, you can forgive and forgive in the manner in which God wants you to without having to say, oh no, it wasn't any big deal. You can call it exactly what it was. If it was offensive, say that it was offensive. If it was hurtful, you say that it was hurtful. But in doing so, don't so maximize it that the door of forgiveness becomes one that really becomes an impossibility. Forgiving God's way means that you see the deed for what it is. If you were not at Sam's Club last night, you might have been the only person in Greensboro who was not. Philip went with me over there. We just needed to get a couple of things. I was going to buy 3 gallons of milk and some apples. And we get in the parking lot is packed. We get in the store, it's crazy. People are going everywhere. We get our milk, we get the apples, and then we head towards the checkout lanes. And all the cashiers and the checkout lines, they're stacked 8, 10 deep and just going back into the store, curving around. But thankfully, Sam's not long ago started these self-checkout lanes. And how it works is, and then there's signs all over the place in that area. I think there's 4 of them, and it says that there's 10 items or less, and you can pay with a MasterCard, Discover card, or debit card. That's it. All right, so those lines are much shorter. Philip and I pull into one of those, and there's one lady in front of us. It's getting ready to be her turn. Again, the sign says 10 items or less. She had over 10 items underneath her cart. And so she's there with a gun, and she's checking everything, and it's taking forever. The line is really starting to back up behind us. The lady behind me, she's starting to really grumble, and she's fussing out loud about this woman. Can't she read? And all this kind of stuff. And so anyway, finally, she has scanned all of her items, and it totals $243. At this point, she goes to get her wallet, and she pulls out this wad of cash, and she starts looking into the machine to see where it is that she can put it. I had some ideas. That wasn't nice. Seeing there is no place, she motions for the employee that's manning that area to come over, and she asks, "Where do I put my money in this machine?" And the lady very gracefully but succinctly says, "You can't use cash at these machines. It's debit card, MasterCard, Discover card. That's what all of these signs say." And to make it even better, do you know what she did? She said, "I'm going to have to cancel this transaction. You're going to have to go get one of those other lines." Oh, I was thrilled. I didn't say anything. I don't even think I smiled, but leaping for joy inside. But one of the things I appreciated about that fact was that she pointed out, hey, this is what all of these signs say. There's at least 5 or 6 of them around, and they're all big letters, clear explanation of this is how it works. These are what the parameters are. And she says to her, this is what it says. These are the parameters, and you're operating outside of that. Now, what I appreciated about her doing that is this. Things never get better. Things never change. People do not learn lessons when wrongs never get identified for being wrong. Listen, as you and I are in relationships with each other, whether that's family or friend or coworker, there's going to be instances when we get at odds with each other. But things will never get any better when we just pretend as though there's nothing that has been an offense, as though we just try to throw it back into the recesses of our mind and act as though it didn't happen. It did happen, and so if you want to forgive God's way, call the deed for what it is. Don't try to make it go away and make it trivial, but by the same token, don't exacerbate it by making bigger than it is. Do as Joseph did. I am your brother whom you sold into slavery. All this happened because you did this. These past 20-some years, this is because of what you have done. Forgiving God's way means that you see the deed for what it is. But it also means something else, and that is that you focus on what God has done. That you focus on what God has done. Again, imagine what Joseph's brothers are thinking at this point. They're thinking, we're sunk. You could have heard all of them gulp. Not saying anything. They're wondering, what now is this man who has such immense power going to do? If he wants us in prison, we'll be in prison. If he wants us executed, he could have us executed. If he wants us beaten, that could happen as well. Now may be the time that he wants to exact revenge for what we did to him so long ago. But notice what Joseph does. It's verse 5. He responds to them so graciously, lovingly, and with such forgiveness in his heart. He says, "But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here." Guys, you did this. But then he says, "God sent me here before you to preserve life." And then he begins to explain that in verse 6, and he says, there's this famine that's been going on now for 2 years. God has made clear that it's going to occur for 5 more years. And though you sold me into slavery, what God has done, I believe, is to lead me to this point. Verse 7, to preserve a posterity for you in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. This is what you did, but let me tell you what God has done. God has brought me to this point, into this place, so that I could save your lives. So that there could be a posterity, so that generations might come from us. And do you know one of the generations that came from them? Jesus. From the line of who? Of Judah. Think of what Joseph could have done. And honestly, if we're candid, most of us would probably say, I don't know if that's exactly the course that I would have taken. A lot of times what we would do is to take the easy route, which is to really just grind these guys. So it is your stinking fault that all of this happened in the first place. 20-some years ago, I was just out running an errand for my father to check and see how you were doing. I'm approaching from a distance, and all of a sudden you're starting to talk about and conspire to kill me. Thankfully, you relented from that, but you threw me in this pit and then decided, oh, there's some slave traders coming by. Let's sell him to them. So you watch me as I am bound hand and foot being drug off to Egypt. I wind up in some dude named Potiphar's house as his slave, and his wonderful wife accuses me falsely of rape, so that not only do I wind up in prison, I wind up in the dungeon of the prison. Not for a few days, but for a few long years. Does he focus on what? Does he zero in on all that they have done and all these negative consequences? No. What does he do? He focuses on what God has done. He says, God has worked through, you did this. You sold me into slavery. But what God has done is to get me to this place that I might be able even to save your lives. A few chapters later, in chapter 50, Joseph is going to seek again to reassure his brothers. And this is what he says to them about their actions. He says, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. You sought to hurt me, but I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to focus on how God worked and used this for good. When you and I are wronged, at least in some small way, it affects the trajectory of our lives, doesn't it? I mean, sometimes significantly, sometimes less so. But when you and I are wrong, it affects our experiences going forward. Things are now different than they would have otherwise been. Hold that thought for just a moment. As you hold that thought, remember what Paul says in Romans chapter 8, what God through him says. That we know that God works all things together for good to those who love Him, who are the called according to His purpose. Now, Paul does not say that all things are good. Rather, he says God works all things together for good. That means He uses happy and pleasant and joyful things, things that make our day, that put a smile on our face. But also means that He uses grievous, painful, sorrowful, even heinous things to accomplish good. Joseph says, guys, this is what you did, and that affected the trajectory of my life. My experience was different. But what God did was to take something as horrible as slavery and use it to accomplish good. I want you to understand that God can use anything, absolutely anything, to accomplish good purposes. Let me give an example. Sometime back, a friend of mine who's on staff at a church in the Triangle area was telling me about a mission trip that his brother Will went on to the jungle region, very remote area in Peru. There was a small team of guys that went, and they spent a number of days there in the jungle. And among the things that they brought, one of the guys, as a part of their group, brought a guitar. He wasn't a great guitar player, but he thought, we're going to have some downtime. It's not like we're going to be watching TV or doing anything else, so I'll just kind of have something to pick on. And so he brought his guitar. throughout these series of days, they've been, with the help of a translator, talking to people in this remote village, and they've been sharing the gospel, and already some people are responding to faith in Christ. The last night, though, the plan is that they're going to have a worship service with the entire village. But before the service begins, the chief comes to them and, with the help of a translator, says to Will, I want you to sing something tonight, and points to the other guy and says, I want him to play that instrument. Well, Will didn't think of himself to be a singer, and the other guy, that he wasn't prepared for something like that. He's not much of a guitar player. And so Will begins to ask him, hey, do you know this song? Do you know that song? Different hymns, different praise choruses. And the guy's like, I know that song, but I can't play that one. I know that, I don't know that one. I can't play that one, can't play that one. And so finally, they keep going through this list. And the only song that Will knows the words to that this guy can play is the old rock and roll song, Knock, Knock, Knocking on Heaven's Door. Here's some of the lyrics. Mama put my guns in the ground. I can't shoot them anymore. That long black cloud is coming down. I feel like I'm knocking on heaven's door. So that's the only the chief expects us to sing and for you to play. This is the only song we know. This song won't be translated, so here we go. The service begins in this remote part of Peru, and they sing one of Bob Dylan's greatest hits, Knock, Knock, Knocking on Heaven's Door. Probably not how we would necessarily plan to lay out a worship service. What's interesting, though they didn't understand a word of what was said, had no idea anything that was said, they were moved to the point where they were standing and clapping as soon as this song was over. And what's amazing is that, as this story is being recounted to me, that song, as strange as it was used to prepare their hearts for the message, and scores of people that night made a decision to follow Jesus. With a Bob Dylan song that you wouldn't think has any place in church, much less in a worship service in a jungle. What I'm trying to say to you is that God can use and regularly uses anything and everything, good things, pleasant things, hurtful things, joyous things. He uses all things to accomplish good purposes. And you and I, in the process of seeking to restore relationships and extend forgiveness, too often we can get mired in the quagmire of focusing on the wrong. And this is what you did to me, and this is how you hurt me, and this is how this affected me. But Joseph, as a man that's forgiving God's way, he doesn't do that at all. He says, hey, you meant to do this for evil, but God meant it for good. And I'm going to focus on, and I'm going to tune in on, and I'm going to zero in on what it is that God has done. God has worked to bring me to this place to save your lives, to save millions of people here in Egypt so that there would be a posterity for the future. Listen, if you're going to forgive God's way, yeah, you call the deed for what it is, but don't get stuck there. Don't focus on the wrong. Focus how God can even take an offense, even though your life is different now, to accomplish altogether good purposes. But there's one final thing that forgiving God's way means. Another thing that we see going on here that communicates what forgiving God's way actually looks like. And it means this, that you experience what can be. That you experience what can be. In verse 9, Joseph, he's revealed himself to his brothers. And he tells them, hurry up and go get my father. Verse 9, say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of Egypt. He says, guys, go back home, tell Daddy the story. Tell him how God has worked. I'm now the prime minister of Egypt. And then I want you to bring him back. I want you to come, guys, you and all your families, all your stuff, all your animals. He says in verse 10 that you're going to dwell in the land of Goshen. You're going to be near me, you and your children, their children, your flocks, your herds, everything that you've got. Guys, I'm going to set you up out in this wonderful area. And there's going to be plenty of food. I'm going to provide homes for you. This is where we're going to be. And guys, we're going to be together again. Verse 11, I will provide for you, lest you and your household and all that you have come to poverty, because there's still 5 more years of famine left. Guys, I'm going to take care of you. Wonderfully gracious. Verse 14, though, is interesting. After he's given those instructions, he looks over at Benjamin. The rest of the brothers are half-brothers to him, but He and Benjamin share the same mother. This is his full brother. And as he looks at Benjamin, he is moved to tears. It says that he grabs Benjamin's neck and wept on his neck. The emotion is so overwhelming. Verse 15, moreover, he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. And after that, his brothers talked with him. I want you to recognize just how amazing this is and what a turnaround has been experienced and witnessed. Do you remember back when we started this series, one of the first messages out of the gate, one of the passages that we dealt with, says of Joseph and his brothers that they could not even speak peaceably to him. They loathed Joseph. They could not stand him. They deplored the favoritism that Jacob showed him. They didn't like that he paraded around like a goody-goody, especially wearing that coat of many colors. They absolutely could not stand him, and it was so bad, they couldn't even have a civil conversation. Hey, Joseph could say, hey, it looks like some rain's coming today. Yeah, I hope it drowns you. I mean, that's the type of conversations that they were having. And it was so bad that they plotted murder, but then relented and settled on slavery. That's how bad things were. And now what's going on? They're embracing. They are weeping over each other. They are talking with each other. You know, for too many that have been wronged, and maybe you're in this category, someone has offended you in some way, and this whole idea of forgiveness and this type of forgiveness, you say that's just too much. That's just too much. That can't be a reality for me. Here's the question, why do you say that? Why would you say that? I believe for many, they would say, well, I can't forgive because the deed was so bad. Or they may say this, even if I forgive them, things won't ever be how they were before. I'm unwilling to forgive, to go through what it would take to experience that, because if I do, things will not be like they were before. Let me tell you, that can be a wonderful blessing of God. A wonderful blessing of God, that things will not be like they were before. Think of how things were before between Joseph and his brothers. They hated him. They couldn't have a peaceful, civil conversation. They planned to kill him, and they relented and sold him into slavery. That's how things were before. But look at what they are now. They're embracing, and they're so moved with emotion that they are weeping. They're talking with each other. They're catching up on what's occurred over the past 2 decades. Yeah, things are different, altogether different, but understand this, they're also altogether better. They're altogether better. You know, when you and I have been wronged, as we're seeking to move on and move past that, and we're wrestling with issues of forgiveness, yeah, we've got to say things will not be the same. They won't be. They have been affected by all of this. But it does not mean that you cannot experience a relationship that is healthy, that's meaningful, that's strong, beneficial, and oftentimes even better than it ever was before. Might it take some time to rebuild and reestablish trust? Sure it may. Might it require some real effort and some intentionality and developing healthy communication? Sure. But when we forgive God's way, we can not only experience what used to be, we can experience what can be, what should be, and what ought to be. Back in February, we just moved to a new house, and in the days just before closing, I was talking with my insurance agent to get the new house covered to transfer the policy. And as part of that process, they sent me this questionnaire to fill out about the house we were buying, and it asked a number of things about the structure and wiring and all this type of stuff. One of the questions on that survey, though, said, is there a wood stove in the house? If yes, list the make and the model, and then it says, is it UL listed? UL listing, if you're probably familiar with that, most electrical devices, they've been through UL labs to certify that they are safe to operate. Anyway, I head over to the house, and because the house had a wood stove, and I got the make and the model, and I start looking on it. I can't find a UL tag on it. It may be in the back, maybe on one of the sides. I can't get to that because it's an insert. And so I just put unknown. I scanned that, sent it back to the insurance agency. And I'd say in less than 5 minutes, I get a call back from one of the agents, and she said, "I am so sorry." She said, "But this company will not permit us to write coverage on a home that has a wood stove that's not UL listed. So it has to be UL listed." I said, "Well, what do I do?" And I said, "Closing is just a couple of days away." And she says, "Well, check as best you can. See if you can find a UL tag on it. If so, let us know. Otherwise, you've either got to change insurance companies or you got to get that stove out." Well, in truth, I didn't have enough time to switch insurance companies, and I investigated. I couldn't find a UL tag on there, and so finally I'm left with my only remaining option, which is to get this stove yanked. Well, I didn't want to do that because I actually wanted to hold on to this wood stove. If the power went out or if it was really cold, I thought it'd be kind of nice to have that as some supplemental heat. It's already there. I'd like to be able to keep that. But I can't do that. And so the next day I had a chimney sweep come over there, and he's going to take this thing out. What was interesting is that as he is taking this stove out, he's telling me what he's seeing, and he says, this thing was not installed properly. He said, coming out of the back of it, up into the flue, a part where you couldn't see, there was only a stovepipe about this long. And he said, this is the emphatically wrong way to install this. He said, this is a terrible fire hazard. And as he pulls it out, he pulls out a couple of fist-sized, what appears to be hunks of charcoal. And he says, this is evidence of a chimney fire that has occurred in here. He said, it's a good thing you got this thing out of here. He said, it's a terrible fire hazard. I didn't want to have to take the stove out. I wanted to hold on to it. I didn't want to have to pay somebody else to do something else. But you know what? I'm sure glad that I got it out because my house is a lot safer because of it. I didn't want to do it. It wasn't fun. It cost me something, but I'm far better off because of it. Listen, having conversations with people who have wronged you and communicating what it is that you have experienced, doing so in a way that is candid but also not over the top, those aren't pleasant. Those aren't easy. Those aren't fun conversations. What I am telling you, though, is this. If you will do this and do this how God expects us to, it may not be fun. It may not be pleasant. But you and the relationship will be 1,000 times better off than it ever would have before. Because oftentimes those conversations lead us to be candid about some things that have been bubbling under the surface, potentially even for decades. And when that happens, when this occurs God's way, you're able to experience your own personal portrait of what we see going on in Joseph's life. Things aren't like they used to be. They are altogether better. Experiencing what can be, what could be, what should be. Weeks ago, we started walking through Joseph's life in a series that I called Better You Than Me, Avoiding the School of Hard Knocks. The premise of that thought is this: it is far better for us to learn from the failures and the successes and the costs of others, to look to their example and learn from it so that we don't have to repeat those same mistakes and pay those same prices. Over these weeks, we've seen Joseph get a number of things really wrong. We've seen him get a number of things really right. In this instance, he knocks it out of the park. He's doing exactly what I believe God wants us to do. When God said to forgive as He has forgiven us, I believe that means that we call the deed for what it is. We view it for what it was. It means that we don't minimalize it. We don't maximize it. We call it for what it was. It means that we focus on how even a wrong God has been able to use and to work for good purposes, and that we pursue not only what can be, but what before God should be. It's far better to learn this from somebody else than having to go through that path yourself. The question is, will you decide today, I'm going to learn from that example, and I'm going to start forgiving God's way? Will you bow your heads with me? When we talk about being wronged, some of you immediately had something perhaps that came to mind. Maybe it was something that a spouse, a friend, a coworker, classmate, someone did or said to you, and it just hurt, stung. Things aren't well between you and them right now. And you really struggle with what God through Paul